This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom, where you can pre-order every card from Phyrexia All Will Be One right now using my referral link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Phyrexia All Will Be One limited set review. So far I've looked at the multicolored colorless white and blue cards in the set, and today we're continuing with a look at black. Tomorrow I'll give you my thoughts on all the red cards in the set, and so on. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, and if you aren't sure what those letter grades mean, check out the description where you can find an explanation. Before we take a look at the first card, a few reminders. This review is about limited in the new format. That means draft and sealed, and that means that I'm only reviewing cards that appear in draft boosters. Also keep in mind that these are my feelings about these cards before actually playing the new format. That means I'm definitely not going to be perfect in my predictions. After all, every format is different, but as I play the format, I'll be providing updates about it here on the channel. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, you'll have access to a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our first black card, which is Ambulatory Edifice, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 artifact creature Phyrexian construct at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you can pay 2 life, and when you do, target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. When you can kill something with the -1/-1, this is going to feel pretty good. When you can't, it won't feel very good. Sometimes you'll be able to weaken something in a way that is beneficial for you, but you definitely want to be killing stuff with this or it's unimpressive. This card's a little weird to me because we've seen versions of this card that always give -1/-1 without paying life, so it is a bit of a bummer that you have to do that here. It may mean that the -1/-1 effect plays extra well in this format, so maybe they had to add a downside. In the end, it does have significant 2-for-1 potential and a reasonable baseline, so I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Annihilating Glare, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, you pay 4 or sacrifice an artifact or creature, destroy target creature or planeswalker. This is reminiscent of Eaten Alive, a common removal spell that played really well in a format that had lots of expendable tokens. You know what this format has? That's right, lots of expendable tokens, especially if you're in black-white and have access to lots of mites. Paying 5 to kill something definitely isn't premium, but the upside is that this can also be bone splinters, and I think that means that this gets into the lower premium range. Destroying planeswalkers does matter a tiny bit too, because you will see more of them in this format, but you're still not going to see them very often. But yeah, I think this gets into the lower premium range. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Anoint with Affliction, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant. It says exile target creature if it has mana value 3 or less, and it has Corrupted, which means if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, this gets better. In this case, it can just straight up exile any creature when it has Corrupted online. This is great. Even without Corrupted, you would basically always play at least the first copy of this. So the fact that this is able to remove anything by the mid to late game a lot of the time is awesome. This is definitely premium removal that you can spend a high pick on. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Fiend of the Dross, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 6/6 creature, Phyrexian Demon at rare. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, it does so with 4 oil counters. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove an oil counter from Fiend of Dross. Then, if it has no oil counters on it, you lose the game. Whenever a creature an opponent control dies, its controller loses 2 life. So, a 4-mana 6/6 flyer can end the game pretty quickly, and it better, because if this stays in play too long, it is going to make you lose the game. That said, 4 oil counters is kind of a lot for a creature this big that can come down this early, especially because the Fiend punishes your opponent for losing creatures in play too, plus Proliferate can keep you from losing. The downside here is definitely real, but the upside is so good that this is something you're always going to play in your black decks and something you'll take really early. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Bilius Skull Dweller, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 Phyrexian insect at uncommon. It's got Death Touch and Toxic 1. A 1-mana 1/1 with Death Touch usually comes out as like a C. It can trade for anything, including trading up. It gets interesting with fight effects too, if you're in green. And adding Toxic 1 to this does make it more of an upgrade, as it makes it more of a problem as an attacker. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Black Sun's Twilight, which for X and a black is a rare instant. It says up to one target creature gets -X until end of turn. If X is 5 or more, return a creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So let's take away the X is 5 or more part of the card. If that's what this was, it would already be pretty good. While it would never feel super efficient, the fact it scales all game long is great. That card would probably be a B-, and adding this massive late game upside is huge because killing an opposing creature and reanimating one of yours at the same time is a pretty incredible 2-for-1. Keep in mind that this is an instant too, so you can get rid of their best creature at the end of their turn and reanimate your best creature at the same time, untap, and the board is completely different. I think the whole package here is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Blight Belly Rat, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 Phyrexian Rat at common. It's got Toxic 1, and when it dies you proliferate, which means you choose any number of permanents or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. A 2-mana 2/2 is a passable place to start, so adding both Toxic and a nice death trigger to the mix probably makes this a pretty good common. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Bone Picker Scourge, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 Phyrexian Imp at common. It's got Flying and Corrupted. It gains Death Touch and Lifelink. A 3-mana 2/2 flyer isn't as good these days as it used to be. It's like a C-, but adding some additional effects does still make for a pretty nice card, and that's certainly what we have here. It's sort of a build-your-own Vampire Nighthawk. If this always had Death Touch and Lifelink, it would probably be pretty close to a B+, but you do have to jump through some hoops to get there. Enough that I think this probably drops all the way to a C+. Next up, it's Chittering Skitterling, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/4 Phyrexian Rat at uncommon. It has Corrupted. If you have 3 or more poison counters on your opponent, you can use this ability, which says sacrifice an artifact or creature, draw a card, and you can only do it once a turn. A 3-mana 1/4 is sort of passable, but man, this has a nice ability if you can get Corrupted going. Cashing in irrelevant artifacts or creatures for cards is always nice. There's lots of sacrifice fodder in the set. It also has the potential to combine quite well with this format's Threaten effect, although, as we'll see tomorrow, it's actually at uncommon, so getting both of them together will be a little harder, but sacrificing stuff for free does always have the upside of working really well with a card that steals an opposing card for a turn. I think this is a C+. Next, it's Cruel Grimnark, which costs 5 generic and a black for a 5/5 Phyrexian Cleric at common. It's got Death Touch. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. For each opponent who can't, you gain 4 life. Oftentimes, a creature that makes your opponent discard really drops off in like the mid to late game because your opponent is in top deck mode, so it's nice that this can gain you 4 life in that situation. We're still talking about a creature that is significantly below rate. Adding Death Touch to a 5/5 isn't a huge upgrade, and if your opponent just holds on to a land in the late game, you'll still have the usual downside without really having access to that 4 life. It's probably just a C-. Next, it's Cutthroat Centurion, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 artifact creature Phyrexian Warrior at common, and you can sacrifice another artifact or creature to give it +2/+2 until end of turn, activate only once each turn. This can threaten to become a 4/4 anytime it swings, which is nice. This kind of card often gets through without you actually having to sacrifice anything to it in the early game because the opponent just can't muster a good block. This also combines well with various sacrifice synergies and with all the might tokens. And being a free sacrifice effect once again means this pairs really well with Red's Threaten effect. Seems like a solid card that probably overperforms a little in the right deck. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it is Drivenod, Carnage Dominus, which costs 3 generic and 2 black for an 8/3 legendary Phyrexian Horror at Mythic Rare. If a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time, and you can pay 2 black Phyrexian mana and exile 3 creature cards from your graveyard, put an indestructible counter on Drivenod, and of course Phyrexian mana can be paid, in this case with either black or 2 life. This is the first 8/3 in Magic history, so if you think this stat line is strange, you're not wrong. Triggering death abilities more is pretty sweet, especially because this format has a decent number of them. Like the others in this cycle, it can also become indestructible, in this case by using the graveyard. An 8/3 indestructible is an absolute beast for sure, as your opponent will basically be out of luck when it comes to ever blocking it effectively, but before you can make this indestructible, it dies to several common and uncommon removal spells in the format that cost a lot less than 5 mana, and that is rough. The upside is you can wait to play it until you have the cards in your graveyard, since it can become indestructible without you actually having any mana up. But that also means you have to wait until significantly later to play this, because getting 3 creatures into your graveyard isn't exactly a cakewalk. It's a great card, but I think it falls a little short of being a bomb. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it is Drown in Ikor, which costs 1 generic and a black for an uncommon sorcery. Target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn, proliferate. This is amazing removal. -4/-4 is enough to kill the majority of creatures, and this is cheap enough that you can trade up in a big way. If you get value out of Proliferate too, it will feel truly absurd. It is kind of funny that this can also kill the Dominus we just saw, even when it's indestructible. But yeah, great card. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Duress, which costs 1 black mana for a common sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-creature, non-land card from it. That player discards that card. This is usually a sideboard card. Against someone who isn't a creature-heavy deck, it is worth using, but against your typical limited deck, there's a pretty good chance you just whiff completely, in which case it will feel like you paid 1 mana to mulligan, which feels pretty rough. It's an F as a main deck card and a C- out of your sideboard. Next, it's Feed the Infection, which costs 3 generic and a black for an uncommon sorcery. It says you draw 3 cards and you lose 3 life. If you have Corrupted online, your opponent also loses 3 life. Lately, sorcery speed card draw effects that make you lose life have felt pretty bad, since you spend a significant amount of mana, don't add to the board, and actually help your aggressive opponent. However, I do think making your opponent lose 3 as well is a significant upgrade. If that's what this card always was, it would probably be like a C+. You still wouldn't really want more than 1, but that first copy is pretty nice. And that's sort of the ceiling for the card. Obviously in a deck that can't do poison counter stuff consistently, this is pretty bad. It does feel to me right now, and it's always hard to predict these things, but it feels to me like this format will be fairly aggressive, which also hurts this card's stock. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it is Fleshless Gladiator, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 Phyrexian skeleton. At common, it's got Corrupted, and for 2 generic and a black, you can return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. You lose 1 life. This seems like a solid common. You can play it early as a bear, and then in the mid to late game, it can start coming back from your graveyard, which can net you a pretty real advantage, whether you're sacrificing it or you just keep bringing it back to block or whatever. I'm giving it a C+. Next, it is Geth, Fane of Contracts, which costs 1 generic and 2 black for a 3/4 legendary Phyrexian zombie at rare. Other creatures you control get -1/-1, and you can pay 1 generic and 2 black to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains. If this creature would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. Activate only as a sorcery. So, giving your whole board -1/-1 isn't normally something you're going to want to do in Limited, even if you do get a 3-mana 3/4 out of the deal. However, Geth does come with the powerful ability to repeatedly reanimate things from your graveyard, which does balance things out a bit. Obviously, the things you reanimate will be a little worse, but if he's left unchecked, Geth will quickly populate your board with everything in your graveyard. That said, he's going to be really tough to play in the early game, and all game long there will be scenarios where playing him kills 1 or 2 of your creatures, and that will be particularly painful if your opponent can simply deal with Geth on their turn before you ever use this ability. I think the downside, coupled with the need to load your graveyard for him, probably means he's just a C+. Next up, it's Gulping Scrap Trap, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/4 Phyrexian horror at common. When it enters the battlefield or dies, you proliferate. This can proliferate twice, which is some serious upside in the set. That often means your opponent's going to have 2 more poison counters. Of course, it also happens to be a dismal 5-mana 4/4. That makes it hard for me to give it anything other than a C. Next up, it's Infectious Inquiry, which for 2 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It says you draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life. Each opponent gets a poison counter. Black usually gets a common that does some version of draw 2, lose 2, and it's usually passable. Not adding to the board can be a liability, and this format does feel like it will be a fast one, as I've said, so you never really want more than 1 of these, but the first copy seems alright. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it is Cherumonix the Rat King, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 legendary creature, Phyrexian Rat. At rare, it's got Toxic 1. Other rats you control have Toxic 1, and when Cherumonix enters the battlefield, you look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal any number of rat cards from among them and put the revealed cards into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. We have a new legendary rat who is a rat payoff, which is pretty exciting for me. If you don't know, my wife and I have a bunch of pet rodents, including rats. I actually wrote an article over on the Card Kingdom blog about how excited I am for this card and showing a couple of different Commander decks you could build around it. Also, if you are interested in seeing some of the rodent part of my life, my wife actually has an Instagram where she posts lots of cute rodent content. You can find her there with the username cozy_keepers. Kind of funny that this card just allowed me to plug my content and my wife's content. But anyway, there are two other rats in this format, one at common and one at uncommon, so the Enter the Battlefield ability does actually have an okay chance to draw you a card sometimes, especially because both of those rats are really playable. But even if you don't draw a card off of this, you're getting a 3-mana 3/3 with Toxic 1, which is probably a card you always play anyway. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Necrogen Communion, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature you control. Enchanted creature has Toxic 2, and when that creature dies, return it to the battlefield under your control. I never really liked this kind of card. It's rare that an aura that brings a creature back when it dies is worth it, and I don't think adding Toxic 2 is enough to make a difference. Both of these effects really only matter if the creature you're putting it on is already good, and while, yeah, putting this on your bomb or whatever feels amazing, you're frequently going to have situations where you just have nothing worth putting this on. You know, the best auras are the ones that make your creature a lot better, make any creature better. This doesn't really do that. I'm giving this a D. Next up, it is Necrosquito, which for 3 generic and a black is a 0/0 Phyrexian insect at uncommon. It enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters. It gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. And whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put an oil counter on Necrosquito. 4-mana 2/2 flyers have felt really bad lately, mostly because they usually die to common 1-mana removal. However, this can grow quite quickly and get out of range of that kind of stuff, especially if you're combining it with sacrifice effects. But even combat can lead to this being an impressive flyer. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Razer Paladin, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/4 Phyrexian Knight at uncommon. It's got Toxic 2, and when it enters the battlefield, you return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to your hand. This can grant you a 2-for-1, which is nice, and the 5-mana 4/4 Toxic 2 body it gives you isn't the worst thing ever. Still, it feels a little too inefficient and a little too specific about what it can return to your hand. Maybe I've just been spoiled by Gravedigger, but I feel like if I'm spending this much mana, I should be able to get back at least a wider variety of creatures. Still, the first copy is pretty nice in most black decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Offer Immortality, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant. Target creature gains Death Touch and indestructible until end of turn. We see basically this exact card all the time. It doesn't have the upside of helping you do more damage to your opponent, like a lot of tricks do, but it trades that in for the flexibility of winning virtually any combat and saving your creature from most removal. And I think that's a fair trade, giving it a C. Next up, it's Pestilent Siphoner, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 Phyrexian insect at common. It's got flying and Toxic 1. This seems solid enough. It represents a real threat thanks to having Toxic, and it's likely to contribute a few poison early, which will help you turn on your corrupted effects. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it is Forexian Arena, which for 1 generic and 2 black is a rare enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. This is a sweet reprint, and I think a great card in the format. It doesn't add to the board, which seems like it has been a liability in a lot of sets lately, but the card advantage it grants you really allows you to overwhelm your opponent. Losing life is a fine price to pay for something this powerful. I think in the old days of Limited, this was just like an A+, but in this world where getting on board early has become increasingly important and creatures have gotten a lot better, it probably tops out as a B+. And if the format is really fast, it may even slip down a little further. Next up, it's Phyrexian Obliterator, which for 4 black mana is a mythic rare Phyrexian horror with trample, and when a source deals combat damage to it, that source's controller sacrifices that many permanents. So this is a big incentive to go mono black, as the Obliterator makes your opponent's life incredibly difficult. Blocking it or attacking into it and coming out ahead is basically impossible, and your opponent has to have removal that doesn't do damage to ever feel good about things. Otherwise, they're going to be losing several permanents just to take it down. Most limited formats don't have a ton of decks that would be able to consistently cast something for 4 mana of the same color. But I think if I open one of these, I would be pretty tempted to try to see if a mono black deck is open enough. And if you end up in that kind of deck, it will feel like a bomb, like an A-, but that's a big caveat. There are going to be times where you should just abandon it because black isn't open enough. Next up, it's Ravenous Necro Titan, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 6/6 Phyrexian horror with mythic rare. When it enters the battlefield, sacrifice a creature unless an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. A 4-mana 6/6 that always makes you sacrifice a creature when it enters isn't great, except in decks with good sacrifice fodder, and while it's nice that sometimes this will just be a straight up 4-mana 6/6 with no downside, it will probably be at a point in the game where it isn't that imposing. We're still just talking about a card that's biggest upside is that it's a big vanilla creature, and that isn't that exciting. I think this is just a C. Next up, it is Scheming Aspirant, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/3 Phyrexian Advisor at uncommon. Whenever you proliferate, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So, proliferate is already something you want to be doing in black, so the fact that this also lets you drain your opponent for 2 every time you do is great. That is a 4-point life swing, which has a massive impact on the game. There's enough proliferate in the format, even just in black, that I think this will be a good inclusion. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Sheoldred's Edict, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant. It says choose one. Each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature, or each opponent sacrifices a creature token, or each opponent sacrifices a planeswalker. Edict effects aren't nearly as good in limited as in constructed, mostly because most decks have multiples of creatures in play and can really minimize the downside. This one is an instant, and it gives you 3 options that should, in theory, allow you to maximize what it can do, but you're still almost always going to choose the regular creature option. If your opponent has a planeswalker, this does just straight up kill it for the most part in limited, and that's nice, but again, those are at rare and mythic. So you mostly have to look at this as a mediocre removal spell that you don't have that much control over after the early game, giving it a C. Next up, it's Sheoldred's Head Cleaver, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/4 Phyrexian Warrior at common with Menace and Toxic 2. A 4-mana 2/4 with Menace is not very good, and while adding Toxic to the mix is nice, this still dies to a whole lot of common double blocks. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Stinging Hivemaster, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 Phyrexian Warlock at common. It's got Toxic 1, and when it dies, it makes a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. This is a great common. A 3-mana 3/2 with Toxic 1 is already something you're going to consider playing, so the fact it spits out a Might when it dies is great. This is good to sacrifice to some of the cards we've already seen. It's worth noting that the token's inability to block does lower the value of the token somewhat, but there are lots of ways to take advantage of that extra body, including sacrifice, as already mentioned. The token's also an artifact, which some cards care about. So this is a good rate. It does a lot for a common that only costs 3 mana, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Testament Bearer, which for 3 generic and a black is a 4/1 Phyrexian Warrior at common, and when it dies, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. This can give you a 2-for-1 with some nice card selection, and it can sometimes trade for something big and significant because it has 4 power. That said, having 1 toughness also means it can't even block Might tokens very effectively, and that does seem like a problem in this format. It isn't the worst sacrifice fodder, but it's not the best either because, it doesn't actually add to the board after it gets killed and you paid 4 mana for it. I think it's probably just a C-. Next up, it is Vat Emergence, which for 4 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It says put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control, proliferate. We've seen many 5-mana reanimation spells be complete duds. There's one at uncommon in most sets. They tend to underwhelm because it's hard to consistently get something back that's actually worth the investment, plus it's situational. However, there are a couple of things going on here that I think really change things. First, there's Proliferate, which has synergy everywhere in the format. It also means if, you reanimate a creature that cares about oil counters or has oil counters, you're just going to make it a little bit better because it's going to come back with an extra oil counter. So that makes it more likely you can spend 5 and get back 5. But I think more importantly, it can also reanimate cards from your opponent's graveyard. We almost never see that effect at lower rarities these days. But obviously, adding your opponent's graveyard to the mix doubles the chances that you'll have something that's worth reanimating for 5. It's still not great because it's situational, but I think I'm going to start the format by probably playing the very first copy of this in most decks, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Vat of Rebirth, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon artifact. Whenever another artifact or creature you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on it, and you can pay 2 generic and a black and tap it to remove 4 oil counters from it, and return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. This seems like it takes too much to work. If you play it early, it will definitely be able to build up counters and then reanimate something at some point, but if you get in the mid to late game, it's likely to be a little slow to actually do anything and just be a huge whiff off the top of your deck. We just saw another uncommon way to reanimate stuff that's just way better, too. So the reasons to run this will be even more minimal. I'm giving it a D-. Next up, it is Vron Executioner Thane, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 legendary Phyrexian vampire at rare. Whenever one or more other creatures you control dies, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This ability triggers only once each turn. This is nice. It has a baseline as a 2 mana 2/2, which is an okay starting point, and its ability to drain 2 for the first creature that dies every turn is huge. Again, this is a 4-point life swing, which is massive. It is the kind of thing that makes combat a real pain for your opponent, and if you have sacrifice stuff going on too, so you can trigger it on their turn, even if they don't attack you, it gets especially silly. I'm giving this a B. Next, it's Vraska, Betrayal's Sting, which costs 4 generic, a black, and a black Phyrexian mana. It's a mythic rare, legendary planeswalker Vraska that starts at 6 loyalty. It has completed, and that means if you paid 2 life instead of black mana for it, it enters with 2 fewer loyalty counters. She has a 0 ability that says you draw a card and you lose 1 life, Proliferate. She has a -2 that says target creature becomes a treasure artifact with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color, and loses all other card types and abilities. And she has a -9 that says if target player has fewer than 9 poison counters, they get a number of poison counters equal to the difference. I think this is a bomb. She can draw you cards and remove creatures, and if you can do both of those, you're usually in good shape with the Planeswalker. Her 0 is really a +1 because of Proliferate, and it synergizes well with all the other counters we've seen. Her -2 can act as really good removal too, especially because it's so easily repeatable. Even if you never raise her loyalty, she can just use that 3 turns in a row, which is usually just going to win you the game. There will be times where you give your opponent a treasure when they actually needed it, but most of the time, it'll be better to give them a treasure than whatever scary creature they have. Her ultimate is kind of silly. If you have some toxic on the board, it can set up a win the turn you use it. Otherwise, you're going to have to wait until your next turn when you use her 0 ability and Proliferate again. Still, her 0 and -2 is where it's going to do the most work, and it's great you can choose to play her on either 5 or 6. I'm giving her an A. Next, it's Vraska's Fall, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker and gets a poison counter. This means we have a second Edict effect at lower rarity in this format, and I really don't like that. I get having 1, especially because they're so much better and constructed, but having 2 is kind of strange. I'm just not that impressed with them in Limited. Like I said, they're really mediocre removal spells that you don't have that much control over after the early game. This one does give you a poison counter, which matters. This gets especially bad because there's so many tokens in the set. Like your opponent giving up a might when you play this is just going to be one of the worst feelings ever. Despite the poison counter, I think this is actually a little worse than Sheoldred's Edict. Sheoldred's Edict only costs 2, and it has a little more flexibility. Like, it will always kill your opponent's Planeswalker, for example, whereas Vraska's Fall doesn't allow that. I think it's just a C-. Next up, it's Whisper of the Dross, which for 1 black mana is a common instant. It says target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Proliferate. If you can kill something with this, or have it help you win combat, it will feel pretty good, since you're only spending a single mana. The problem is, those situations aren't that easy to manufacture. There will be a lot of situations where you're paying 1 black to Proliferate, and while that might be fine in some situations, doing that on its own probably isn't worth it most of the time. I think it's probably just a D+. Maybe it's a little better out of the sideboard. If you play someone in game 1 and they have like 6 X1s that are like real cards, I'm not talking might tokens, then siding this in might make some sense, but I don't think you want to start it with it in your main deck. So, those are all the black cards. In Phyrexia, all will be 1. Tomorrow, I'll be back to talk about all the red cards. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review, don't forget to subscribe. If you're looking for the parts of the set review that are already out right now, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.